Well, there you are. You have arrived. Welcome, dreamer, to Cozy Tales Collective, where time slows, whispers take shape, and every flower has a story to tell. The fountain hums its quiet melody just beyond the bend, and a cozy nook awaits beneath the willow's embrace, perfect for those who dream and wonder. But before we begin, subscribe to this channel and comment where you are listening from. Now let the magic of this story lull you to sleep. The old porch swing creaked as Lena settled beside me, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She had always been a restless one, her eyes filled with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. I could see the storm brewing in her expression, the kind of quiet rebellion that reminded me of myself at her age. "Granddaddy, how did you know what you wanted to do with your life?" she asked, her voice barely above the whisper of the evening breeze. The sky stretched wide before us, painted in strokes of orange and lavender, the last breath of the sun before night took over. I let out a slow sigh, tapping my fingers against the wooden armrest of the swing. I didn't, Lena. Not for a long time. She turned to me then, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Really? But you always seemed so sure." I chuckled, shaking my head. That's the funny thing about life. From the outside, it looks like a straight path, but when you're walking it, it's full of twists and turns you never expected. She exhaled, kicking lightly at the porch floor. I just feel like I should know already. Everyone else seems to. "You sound just like me when I was your age," I said, looking past the horizon, seeing a different time in my mind's eye. I remember feeling caged, like a bird born with wings but no space to fly. Lena tilted her head, intrigued. "Tell me." I settled deeper into the swing, my mind drifting back decades, to a time when I was just a boy in a town too small for my dreams. Back when I was young, I was expected to follow in my father's footsteps. It was the way things were done. Your father was a farmer, you became a farmer. If he was a blacksmith, you took up the hammer. It was tradition, duty, a sense of responsibility, they called it. But in my heart, I knew I was meant for something different. The fields stretched endlessly before me, rows upon rows of crops, but to me, they looked like the bars of a cage. Lena's eyes widened, drawn in by my words. "So what did you do?" I smiled at her eagerness. At first I did what was expected of me. I worked alongside my father, rising before dawn and toiling under the hot sun. But at night, I would read. Books became my escape. They told me of places beyond our small town, of people who had dared to break free. And the more I read, the more I knew I couldn't stay. Lena's fingers curled around the edge of the swing. "But weren't you scared? Of leaving everything behind?" "Terrified," I admitted. But I was more afraid of never trying, of waking up one day and realizing I had let fear make my choices for me. She looked down, thoughtful. "So what happened?" I sighed, my mind wandering back to the night I left. One evening I packed a small bag and crept out while the house was quiet. My heart pounded as I walked down that dirt road, the weight of uncertainty pressing against my shoulders. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to go. And that Lena was the first step toward everything that came after. She was silent for a long moment, processing my words. Then she turned to me, her expression softer, less burdened. "So you're saying it's okay not to know?" I smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I'm saying that the caged bird doesn't always realize the door is open. Sometimes you just have to take a leap and trust that your wings will carry you." The city hummed with a rhythm of its own, a pulse that throbbed beneath the glow of street lamps and echoed in the clatter of carriage wheels. My breath fogged in the crisp night air as I pressed myself against the cool brick wall of the alley, heart hammering as I listened for any sign of pursuit. My father's voice, full of disappointment and iron-wrought expectations, rang in my head, but I pushed it aside. Tonight, I was not Walter Calloway, heir to a hardware empire. I was simply a boy with restless feet and a hunger for something more. The soft rustle of fabric brought my attention to Amelia as she adjusted her shawl, her eyes glinting with mischief beneath the dim glow of the gaslight. "Are you ready?" she whispered, and in that moment I was certain that no man had ever been more ready for anything in his life. I took her outstretched hand, and together we slipped through the back entrance of the club, stepping into a world that defied everything I had ever known. The air inside was thick with the scent of tobacco and sweat, humming with the murmur of hushed conversation and the tinkling notes of a piano warming up for its next number. A haze of cigarette smoke curled in the air, catching in the low golden light of the chandeliers overhead. My eyes darted from face to face, taking in the dark suits, the sequined dresses, the laughter that spilled over from tables crowded with people who lived as though tomorrow was a thing too distant to be concerned with. And then the music started. It began with a low, sultry hum of the bass, the kind that rumbled in your chest and wound its way into your bones before you even knew what had hit you. The piano followed, a bright and playful counterpoint that danced between the rhythm, light as a feather, but just as relentless. Then came the saxophone, warm, brash, and full of something that felt a little like defiance, a little like longing. I had never heard music like this, not in my father's parlor, where the gramophone played only the most dignified of waltzes, nor in the grand halls where business associates spoke in hushed, polite tones over carefully measured glasses of brandy. This was something else entirely. This was alive. Amelia tugged me toward the dance floor, her laughter mingling with the melody as she spun away from me, her dress fanning out like the petals of a wildflower caught in a summer breeze. "Come on, Walter," she challenged, eyes alight with something that dared me to let go. And I did. I let the music take me, let it seep into my veins and loosen the rigid posture drilled into me from years of expectations and duty. My feet found their own rhythm, following Amelia's lead as we wove through the crowd, bodies pressed close, laughter bubbling up in our throats. For the first time in my life, I felt weightless. The night spun on in a blur of music and movement. Drinks passed from hand to hand, voices rising and falling like waves in a storm. I lost myself in it, in the press of people, in the way Amelia's fingers curled around mine, in the way the music made the world feel boundless. It was exhilarating, it was dangerous. And then, like the sudden snap of a taut string, it all came crashing down. A hand, rough and unyielding, clamped down on my shoulder, wrenching me backward. My heart seized in my chest as I turned, expecting to see my father, his fury a storm waiting to break over me. But it was not my father. The man looming over me was broader, his suit ill-fitting, the kind of man who had seen more fights than polite conversation. "You don't belong here, boy," he growled, his breath thick with the scent of cheap whiskey. Before I could react, Amelia was between us, her chin lifted in defiance. "He's with me," she said, her voice unwavering despite the tension crackling in the air. The man's gaze flicked between us, then to something over my shoulder. When he smirked, it sent a shiver down my spine. "That's so," he mused, his grip loosening but not releasing me entirely. "Then you best be careful who you dance with, darling. Some men don't take kindly to sharing." A pit formed in my stomach as Amelia's fingers tightened around mine, a silent warning, a plea to let it go. The music had not stopped, but suddenly it no longer felt like it belonged to me. It was a reminder of how foolish I had been to think I could step outside the life I had been born into without consequence. "Let's go," Amelia whispered, tugging me toward the back exit. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I followed without question, the thrill of rebellion now tainted with something colder, something that whispered of consequences waiting just beyond the dawn. As we burst into the cool night air, I took a deep breath, trying to shake the lingering weight of that moment. The alley was empty, save for the distant echo of laughter spilling from the club's entrance. I turned to Amelia, searching her face for some reassurance that what had happened inside had been nothing more than a momentary ripple in the night. Instead, she reached up, brushing a lock of hair from my forehead with a touch so light it nearly undid me. "You were free in there, Walter," she murmured, a ghost of a smile on her lips. "I saw it. You felt it." I swallowed hard, the taste of smoke and regret thick on my tongue. "And what if freedom isn't mine to have?" She tilted her head, studying me with eyes that held far more wisdom than our years should have allowed. "Then you'll have to decide whether you're willing to fight for it." Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways that night, long after the thrill of the music had faded and the reality of my father's world settled back around me like a cage I had never before realized was locked. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the melody of that forbidden world still thrumming in my veins. I had tasted something dangerous, something intoxicating, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me that I could never be the same again. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing long, restless shadows against the wooden walls of the cabin. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees, staring at the flickering embers as if they could offer me the words I struggled to say. Maggie was a force of nature, I finally murmured, my voice low and heavy. She came into my life like a summer storm, sudden, fierce, and impossible to ignore. Lena sat across from me, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She had been pressing for the truth, urging me to speak of the past I had long buried. Tonight, for reasons beyond my understanding, I found myself willing to unearth it. "You loved her," she said, more statement than question. I exhaled, the sound carrying both weariness and longing. More than I ever thought myself capable of. But love ain't always enough. Maggie had been wild, unapologetically so. The kind of woman who ran barefoot in the fields, who laughed too loudly at my serious musings, who dared me to want more than what I had settled for. She was everything my world was not. I had a life mapped out for me, I continued. An arranged future, one that was practical, secure. The kind of life that would make sense on paper, where duty held more weight than passion. Maggie, she didn't fit in that picture. Lena's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. But she made you happy? A mirthless chuckle escaped me. Happiness. Oh, Lena, she made me alive. There's a difference. I could still remember the way she smelled, like fresh earth after a rain, like freedom. The way she'd grasp my hand and pull me into her world, one where rules didn't bind, where love was reckless and consuming. So what happened? Lena asked gently. I ran a hand through my hair, the weight of the memory pressing down on me. I was a coward. The words burned in my throat. It had taken me years to admit it, even to myself. I had let fear guide me, let obligations outweigh the fire in my heart. I told her I couldn't choose her, I confessed. I told myself I was doing the right thing. That stability, tradition, those were what mattered. She cried, Lena, the kind of tears that don't just fall, they shatter. And then she left, just like that. Lena's gaze softened, the sadness in her expression mirroring the one inside me. Do you regret it? I swallowed hard, my fingers curling into fists. Every damn day. Silence settled between us, thick and unrelenting. The fire crackled, filling the space where words failed. I had built a life without Maggie, a life that was orderly, expected. But in the quiet moments when no one was watching, I still saw her, laughing in the rain, daring me to chase something more than what was safe. Lena shifted, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I understand now. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the turmoil behind her eyes. She wasn't just listening. She was seeing her own heart in my words. Tell me, I said, because suddenly this wasn't just about me. She hesitated, then sighed. I'm in love with someone I can't have. Someone who makes me feel more than I should. Someone who doesn't fit into the life I'm supposed to lead. And now I wonder, if I let them go, will I regret it like you do? I held her gaze, the answer heavy between us. The only thing worse than making the wrong choice is knowing you had a chance at something real and being too afraid to take it. The fire burned low, and for the first time in years I felt the weight of Maggie's absence, as if she had just walked away all over again. I'd been on the road long enough to lose count of the days. Not that I ever kept track. My feet followed the path ahead, and my heart drummed in rhythm with the hum of passing trucks and the occasional song of a morning bird. I was free. That much I knew. Each town I passed through had a story, and each face I met carried its own burdens. I made my bed under the stars more often than in a warm room, and I never stayed anywhere long enough to let the roots dig in. Some nights I'd work a shift washing dishes. Other days I'd split wood or clean out barns just for a hot meal and a few dollars. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that was all I needed. I remember one evening in particular, when the sky was painted with the fire of the setting sun. I had been walking along a stretch of highway outside of a small town in Kansas, my thumb extended out of habit more than hope. Hitchhiking had lost some of its charm since the stories of missing drifters made their rounds, but I was lucky, luckier than most. That's when I met Harlan. The old man sat by a fire just off the road, the scent of charred wood mixing with something sweet, maybe whiskey. His clothes were tattered, his face lined with the years of a man who'd seen too much. But his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, held something else. Amusement, maybe, or recognition. "You walk like a man with nowhere to be," he said, poking the fire with a stick. I stopped, tilting my head at him. "And you sit like a man who's been everywhere." Harlan let out a gravelly chuckle and motioned for me to sit. I hesitated, then settled onto the dirt. He pulled a tin cup from his bag, poured some of whatever he was drinking, and slid it toward me. I took a sniff. Whiskey, all right. But I declined with a shake of my head. He only shrugged. We sat in silence for a while, watching the fire. Then he spoke again, slow and deliberate. "You got the look of someone trying to outrun a ghost." I exhaled through my nose. "Not outrunning, just moving." Harlan nodded like he understood. "Let me tell you something, boy. Most folks spend their lives walking roads someone else paved for 'em. They take jobs they hate, answer to people they don't respect, and wake up every morning feeling a little less alive. But you," he gestured at me with his tin cup, "you walked off that road. Problem is, if you don't figure out where you're headed, you're just wandering." I shifted, picking up a twig and breaking it between my fingers. "And what if wandering is the point?" He grinned, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "Then you best make damn sure you enjoy every step." That night, Harlan and I talked until the fire burned down to embers. He told me about his years riding the rails, the places he'd seen, the love he'd lost. He never said he had regrets, but I could hear them in the spaces between his words. I listened, taking in every syllable like it was gospel. Maybe it was. By morning he was gone. No note, no footprints. just the faint scent of smoke where our fire had been. I didn't need a goodbye. Some people come into your life just long enough to leave you with something to carry. Harlan had given me that much, so I walked on. Not because I was running and not because I had nowhere to be, but because the road still beckoned and I had every intention of seeing where it led. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that settles when a decision has been made but its consequences have yet to unfold. I remember sitting at the edge of that small cot, the wooden floor beneath my feet colder than the breath of night slipping through the cracks in the walls. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing along the simple walls of our borrowed shelter. Maggie sat beside me, her fingers curled around mine, the weight of our choice resting between us like a specter neither of us could shake. For the first time in my life, I had chosen something purely for myself, not for my father, whose every word was etched with expectation, not for my mother, who clung to the dream of seeing me settled among familiar faces and traditions, not even for the neighbors, whose hushed whispers would soon weave themselves into the fabric of scandal. No, this decision was mine and Maggie's alone, and for it we would pay. The call to return home had been clear, yet the lure of a different life, one filled with possibility rather than predestination, was stronger. Maggie, ever resolute, had only asked me once, "Are you sure?" And I had answered without hesitation, though my heart trembled at the unknown ahead. The morning we left, the sun barely touched the horizon. The town still slumbered, save for the occasional rustling of animals stirring in the barns and the quiet sigh of the wind through the trees. I expected my father to be waiting, expected him to stand there, arms folded, disappointment carved deep into his face. But he wasn't. Perhaps he had already given up on me, or perhaps he knew that words would no longer tether me to a life I no longer wanted. Maggie's hand tightened in mine as we stepped onto the road leading away from everything we had known. A part of me wanted to turn, to see if someone, anyone, watched us go. But I didn't. Looking back would only weaken my resolve, and I couldn't afford that. Not now. The first days were harder than I had imagined. Money was scarce, and opportunities even scarcer. We moved from town to town, picking up whatever work we could find. Maggie, with her keen mind and steady hands, found a place among the seamstresses in a small shop, stitching dresses for women who never spared her a second glance. I took to hauling, lifting, laboring, work that left my muscles aching and my pride bruised. There were nights when the hunger gnawed at us, when the cold crept in through the thin walls of whatever lodging we could afford. There were days when I saw the weariness in Maggie's eyes and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. And yet, even in our hardest moments, she never spoke of regret. Not once. One evening, as we sat by the fire of a meager boarding house, Maggie reached for my hand. "We have something they don't," she murmured, her thumb brushing over my knuckles. "Freedom, and that's worth more than all the comfort in the world." I wanted to believe her, and maybe I did. But freedom, I was learning, came with its own cost. It was not the dream they painted in stories. It was cold nights and empty stomachs. It was the sting of rejection and the loneliness of knowing we had no place to call our own. It was watching the world move around us, never quite letting us in. Months passed. We grew tougher, wiser. I learned the value of every coin, the importance of every opportunity. Maggie's hands, once so soft, bore the marks of her labor. But she smiled still, laughed even, and that was enough to keep me going. Then came the letter. It was sealed with the crest of my family, an ominous weight in my hands. I hesitated before breaking it open, knowing whatever lay inside could change everything. My father's words were brief, but they cut deep. My return was still possible, but the cost had grown heavier. I could reclaim my place, the security of home and familiarity, but only if I left Maggie behind. There was no room for both in the world he had shaped for me. I read the letter twice, then a third time, my stomach twisting into knots. Maggie sat across from me, silent, waiting. I saw the question in her eyes, but didn't have the courage to speak it aloud. Would I leave her? Could I? She reached for the letter, but I pulled it back, the paper crumpling in my grip. No, I whispered, more to myself than to her. Maggie didn't ask what it said. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she saw the war waging in my soul and chose mercy over confrontation. Instead, she moved to my side, pressing a kiss to my temple. Then we keep going. And so we did. The price of freedom was steep. It cost us the warmth of acceptance, the ease of familiarity. It cost us the right to belong in a world that did not welcome those who strayed from its prescribed paths. But as I looked at Maggie, her eyes filled with determination and something deeper, something resembling love, I knew we had gained something greater. We had chosen each other, and that, I decided, was a price worth paying. I looked across the flickering glow of the fire at Lena, her face cast in warm hues and shifting shadows. Her question lingered in the space between us, heavy like the weight of unspoken memories. Regret, I murmured, rolling the word on my tongue like a smooth river stone. It's a funny thing. Folks like to believe that freedom is a cure for it, that walking away and never looking back is the same as being free of burden. But the truth is, even the freest souls carry something with them. Lena didn't flinch at my words. Instead, she leaned in, her eyes reflecting the dancing firelight, waiting for me to continue. I hadn't spoken about these things in years, perhaps ever, but there was something about her that made me feel like the past deserved to be spoken aloud at least once. I left home when I was young, I said, my voice quieter now. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The world called to me, and I answered. I saw things most men never will, rivers that stretched on for miles like veins in the earth, mountains that kissed the sky, towns where I was no one and everywhere at once. I lived, Lena. I truly lived. I let the silence stretch between us. Let the wind carry my words away before I dared to speak again. But every choice has a price. She nodded, waiting. I lost friendships along the way. People I should have held on to but didn't because the road always felt more important. There were moments I missed with my family, births, deaths, simple days that would have meant something if only I'd been there. And sometimes, when the nights were quiet, I wondered if I'd been right in choosing the road over the roots that tried to hold me. Lena exhaled slowly, almost as if she'd been holding her breath with me. But you never regretted being true to yourself? I shook my head. No, never that. Regret isn't about the choices we make. It's about denying who we are. And I never did that. Not once. She studied me for a long moment, then asked, "Do you ever think about what you left behind? If you'd stayed, would it have made a difference?" I ran my fingers through the dirt at my feet, feeling the earth shift under my touch. Maybe, I admitted. But we all leave things behind, Lena. Even those who stay in one place their whole lives. It's not about the leaving. It's about what we carry forward. The fire cracked, sending embers spiraling into the night sky. I watched them rise, disappearing into the darkness. The people I lost, the places I loved, I carry them with me, always, in the stories I tell, in the lessons I've learned, in the way I keep moving forward. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Lena wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the fire. "I think you're right, Walter," she said softly. "Maybe that's enough." We sat in silence after that, listening to the wind weave through the trees, each of us lost in the weight of what we carried. And for the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. I watched Lena pace the porch, her arms crossed, the flickering lantern light casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits against the wooden planks. Her face was drawn tight with thought, lips pressed together as if holding back a storm of words. I had seen that look before, in young men who feared the weight of their own choices, in soldiers before battle, in myself when I stood at the crossroads of my own fate. "Walter," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what to do." I leaned back in my chair, tapping my fingers against the armrest, giving her the space to speak her mind. "My father wants me to take over the store. He says it's the best life for me, stable and respectable, but She stopped, glancing away as if the truth was something too fragile to look at directly. "I want to be a writer." A slow smile crept up my face. "Well now, ain't that something?" She turned toward me, her dark eyes searching my face. "You don't think it's foolish?" "Foolish? Girl, let me tell you something. I've seen men throw away happiness because they were too scared to reach for it. I've seen others die with regret thick on their tongues because they spent their lives living for someone else. Now I ain't about to let you be one of them." She exhaled a breath she must have been holding. "But my father—" "Your father ain't you, Lena. He sees the world through his own set of troubles and expectations. Maybe he thinks he's protecting you, keeping you from a hard road. But the hardest road of all is the one where you never get to be who you are." She sank onto the porch steps, hugging her knees. I love writing, Walter, more than anything. It's the only time I feel like I can breathe, like I'm myself. But I don't know if I have what it takes. I studied her for a moment, remembering my own doubts, my own crossroads. You remember the first time I told you about my past? About the war? She nodded. I didn't know if I had it in me either. Fear was a constant companion, always whispering in my ear. But I did what needed doing. And after all the dust settled, I found something worth holding on to. My own voice. The question is, do you have the courage to listen to yours? She was silent for a long moment, staring out into the night. Then, finally, she turned to me, resolve settling in her features. I think I do. I chuckled. That's what I thought. The night stretched on, filled with stories and laughter, with dreams spoken aloud and fears named so they would no longer hold power. When Lena finally left the porch, there was a new light in her eyes, a fire that had been waiting to burn. And as I sat there in the quiet, watching the stars, I knew that another soul had found its path. Another traveler had chosen to walk toward their own truth. And that, to me, was worth more than all the battles I had ever fought. The early morning light stretched long across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I stood at the edge of the field, hands resting on the wood of my cane, watching as Lena walked away. Her silhouette was straight-backed, confident, carrying a determination that I recognized all too well. I had walked that same path once, left behind what was known for what was right, and now she did the same. My chest swelled with pride, though it was tempered by the familiar ache of goodbye. The echoes of our ancestors' struggles lay beneath our feet, the soil rich with their stories, their pain, their triumphs. I had spent my life trying to honor them, to make good on the sacrifices they made so that I could be a free man. And Lena understood that more than most. She had always been strong-willed, but this was something different. This was not just defiance, it was purpose. The same fire that had burned in me when I first dared to claim my freedom now burned in her. And though I wanted to reach out, to hold her back for just a moment longer, I knew I could not. To do so would be to deny her what was rightfully hers. I remembered the day I had left the fields, the weight of chains still fresh on my wrists even though they had long since been removed. I had not known where the road would take me, only that I could not stay where I was. Freedom, true freedom, had not been as simple as stepping away. It had been a battle fought every day, in every word, in every step forward. Lena had listened to my stories, absorbed my lessons, and now she carried them with her. The wind stirred through the trees, rustling the leaves as if whispering their approval. The land we stood on had seen so much, pain, injustice, and finally, hope. It had carried the weight of history, just as I had. But now, it was lighter. Now it was Lena's turn to carve her name into its legacy. I turned, walking back toward the house, my steps slower than they used to be, but still firm. Each step carried a memory, the days of toil in the fields, the hunger for knowledge that had driven me to learn, the first time I had dared to dream of something more. And now, this moment, watching her go, was another chapter in the story of our people. A new dawn, a new beginning. As I settled into my chair on the porch, I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun against my skin. My heart ached, yes, but not with sorrow, with hope. Because Lena was not just leaving, she was stepping into the future we had all fought for. And that, more than anything, was worth everything we had endured. I would wait. I would listen for news of her journey, and one day, when she returned, she would bring with her stories of her own, just as I had. She would stand where I stood now, watching the next generation take their turn. And so the echoes of freedom carried on,